All right, everybody. Who's excited to be at the Exploratorium? Put your hands together if you are. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I'm Hugo Bown-Anderson. I lead developer relations at Out of Bounds. And we're really excited to put on this meetup and have you all at the Exploratorium to talk about traditional machine learning, generative AI, data science, if that term is still relevant, and all of these things moving forward. But the first order of business, I'd like to introduce the CEO of Out of Bounds, Ville Tuulos, who led machine learning infrastructure at Netflix for several years, and open source Metaflow there, which is a framework for data scientists and machine learning engineers to be able to do science while leveraging all the beautiful infrastructure we have available today without having to write YAML. So without further ado, put your hands together for Ville Tuulos.
Hello, hello. Like, I heard that there is a free concert in Golden Gate Park, and you all came here, so thank you for that. Good to see so many familiar faces as well as new faces here. And yeah, actually, like, I wanted to get started by asking a question that how many of you have done machine learning before this GenAI boom? Things like XGBoost, scikit-learn. Okay, like maybe, what is that, like maybe 50% even. And like how many of you are now doing something with GenAI? Maybe more like programmatically, like using LangChain and like, okay, like kind of some number, like maybe 30%, that's great. And well, I mean, of course, like what we do is kind of, we are like very, very excited about both. And like, I hope that that's why you are all here today. But actually, like what I wanted to do in this presentation, that I wanted to actually start by talking about SOFAs. And SOFA is not a new acronym like for some like LLM fine-tuning, but actually the actual sofas that you can sit on. And some of you may remember like e-commerce stores like this in 2014. So this was actually the experience if you went to buy a sofa online in 2014. And now if you look at the screen, like you can actually see that it's rather unremarkable. So it's a very standard layout. On the left-hand side, you have the typical filters, like you can choose the color, and like you can choose the material, you can choose the price range, and then like on the other side, like you have the results. And now, like I believe that like maybe many of you are like a technical, like you are building stuff, so you can imagine that like how a system like this works. Maybe many of you have been even like building systems like this. And you can imagine that it's almost like a point-and-click interface for building SQL queries. So you can imagine that basically what happens is that you can do color equals red, and material equals cotton, and then like a price range is greater than $1,000, and you get that information, you send it to the backend, and then like in the backend you execute the SQL against the database, and then you get the results, and then the results are shown here. And now the only difference, the kind of the systems that we have been using since probably 1970s, you could imagine like a terminal for like using a library or like kind of a browsing inventory at the library, like in 1980s with the terminal, that would basically work the same way, with the exception that 2014 we had these images at least here. So I mean like some advancement there. And now if you actually go to the same store today in 2023, I mean this is what the very same store looks like. And you can notice that there are some differences and some commonalities. Well, now, of course, like the differences are easy to spot. I mean, mainly the images are bigger. So I guess like we have more bandwidth now, so we can afford having these prettier images here. But functionally, like the interface is exactly the same. So you still have the filters at the top. You choose the color, you choose the material. Again, I'm pretty sure that on the backend side, like it works roughly the same way that like you execute SQL against the database. Of course, now you are using the 17th iteration of a JavaScript framework just because, but I mean, basically it is the same thing. So now, like if you think about that trend line here, what has happened basically over 10 years, the biggest change over 10 years has been that the images are bigger. And like, of course, I mean, there are like technical reasons why that is the case, but also like a kind of more like a cultural, societal reasons. And one reason is that like, of course, like in 2023, like we have a much larger percentage of the whole society using internet compared to 2014, especially like after the pandemic, like so many people who had never bought anything online started buying stuff online. And what it means is that these experiences need to be more human-like. So they have to be more like emotionally evocative. They have to be more visceral. And that's why you want to have stuff like this. And now, I challenge you that like if you just like follow the trend line, like what will these services look like in like a couple of years' time? So imagine like what the service will look like in 2026, for instance. Well, I mean, if you just like extrapolate, it's easy to see that like, well, it will be even bigger photos, even bigger images, and like all these technical considerations, like the filters and the construction of the SQL query will fade in the background even more and more. And as you can see, I mean, this has nothing to do with any ML stuff and like without any GenAI stuff. And like we could see that like we could have experiences like this. And of course, like this is happening today. I mean, if you think services like TikTok and to a degree maybe Pinterest and so forth, like we can have big photos in the internet. But that's actually not the reason why we are here today. And really the kind of the so exciting thing, like what is actually changing, is that like we have absolutely new things that have been never possible before. And especially like we can have boxes like this. And we can actually start like really thinking like what is actually the most human experience like you could have for someone wanting to buy a sofa online. And now you imagine that this is basically like almost like a showroom experience, like when you go to an actual furniture store. And like you go to a store and there's a human being, a salesperson, that maybe allows you to kind of browse for about like 1.5 minutes and then comes to you saying that, oh, are you looking to buy a sofa or something? And then like you are looking at this sofa here, and then you actually say that like, no, actually like this is not what I'm looking for, I want a pink sofa. And then you can like kind of maybe at the store, like physically, I mean, maybe there happens to be another pink sofa or maybe not. Now, like what's so exciting here is that this is really the first time that like we are actually able to do this programmatically. And like why I think that this is worth emphasizing is that like especially here in San Francisco for the past 6 or 9 months, like of course there has been quite a frenzy about like all these like GenAI techniques. And like now you can of course, probably many of you can imagine that like images like this can be generated using different GenAI methods like a stable diffusion. You can use services like Midjourney, and of course like you can use LLMs here. But now, like, of course, the kind of techniques and the kind of the advancements of these like models is exciting technically by itself, and that's why we have seen like so many services like slapping this basic chatbot type interface on top of like what they have been doing before. But I think like what is even way more interesting, I mean like going even beyond like kind of 2026, is that we can absolutely start reimagining all services, like fundamentally thinking what is the interaction pattern, and we can finally get rid of that 1970s style SQL interface that we have been always using this for. And like we can really start thinking that like, let's say in this case, maybe you want to have the same sofa in leather, and like, yes, I mean, you can like do all this stuff, you can generate all the images. And really the point is like not just like a slap something on top of everything else, but really think that like what is fundamentally different now that we have these amazing new techniques available. And more so, like you can imagine like going to a store and then like not only like you can just like have sofas in different colors, but you can point at things. And you could say that like, well, I mean, that lamp over there, like it looks nice. How much is that lamp? And now you can point at the lamp and you can say that, oh yes, I mean, like we can see that you are like interested in this very thing. And like maybe there's something like a very like a nice like a marketing sales message about this. And then like we have of course like kind of some endorsement. So like really we want you to buy that thing and so forth. And now, if you imagine that like we will have experiences like this in 2026, and these won't happen by themselves. I mean, like I think many of you here are here today, so that like some of us, like some of you, like will be building these experiences. Now the interesting question then becomes that like how does it actually happen? Like how can you build services like this? And by the way, I'm not only talking about like selling sofas. I mean, like even if you are not interested in selling sofas, this applies to all services, all products, all experiences out there. And let's kind of like quickly go through like what it means in practice. So for instance here, like obviously like you want to have that like a query large language model. And there are a couple of things that are worth noticing. The thing number one is that like this is not a chatbot. I mean, this is not like a ChatGPT embedded in an iframe. Because like you can imagine that the point is not to kind of start like putting some like random prompts in the text box, like a talk about the situation in Palestine or like whatever like random things, but really like you want to in your product you want to have the best possible user experience as if like you were talking to the most knowledgeable sofa salesperson in the world. So you really like want to kind of optimize that experience for that very particular use case. And then the thing number 2 that you want to do, because if you imagine that like this is how the world will be like in a couple of years' time, I can guarantee that like everybody else will be doing exactly the same thing. And now like if you are like just calling the ChatGPT APIs and like doing the same thing as everybody else, your storefront like will look like exactly as everybody else's, and it will have the same problems, it will have the same user experience. And like you can imagine that like today with the normal e-commerce, like without LLMs, we are at the point like where the e-commerce stores like desperately like have to differentiate the experience by having better website and better customer service and like kind of everything better than the competition. I mean, the same thing obviously like will happen with the LLMs as well. The other thing that happens here is that like, let's say that the site could be such that the user is able to upload a photo of their own living room and then they can place the sofa there. Well, you know, like there are things like object recognition that actually like used to be like really key challenges in computer vision. These days, like much kind of like well more like better understood than before. But I mean, again, I mean like you want to make sure that that works exactly as intended as well. Now, one super interesting thing about this description, I don't know if you can see the text, but I mean, like that is also generated by LLM about like the bamboo traditions in Laos. It can be total nonsense, I don't know. The key thing here is that like if you think about those 1970s style interfaces that we have been building this far, it used to be so that the engineering department was responsible for building the database. And they built the database and like everything around it, the core interfaces and the APIs and the whole microservices, everything. And then you had a whole another department at your company whose job was then to populate the database and like put these descriptions. Maybe you had designers, maybe you had marketing people, like who knows what, who then like just like wrote this by hand. And their job was to understand the customers. And like their job was to kind of talk from a human being to another human being and then think that, okay, how on earth like can we sell as many of these sofas as possible? And that was their expertise. And now like what is so much changing potentially and most likely like with these LLMs is that actually that responsibility for like generating even that type of content actually like moves like from that other department like to the technical department. Maybe you are going to be called ML engineer, data scientist, whatever it might be. But now like suddenly that like whole like totally changes the organization. And it also means that like you can't just like again, I mean call like a random API and generate some nonsense. But now like that description like becomes of course a part of your company brand. Like it becomes a part like kind of a, what is that like a customer experience. So it's very, very critical that that actually makes sense. The other thing that happens is that the world, of course, like is only becoming more complex. The competition is getting tougher. Like things like marketing is getting harder and harder. Like we are already seeing it today. And like the old like tricks don't work so well anymore. I mean, like good luck, like just like trying to launch a basic banner ad campaign like that. Okay, buy sofas. Nobody cares. Now, I mean, the way how you can penetrate through the noise is that like, well, I mean, maybe you have to do some influencer marketing or something like that. And of course, in this case, like, you can be smart about it. Like maybe depending on who the person is looking at the website. If the person is, let's say, over 50 years old, maybe there's a different influencer. Like maybe if they are 20 years old, there's somebody else. Like maybe it should be Mr. Beast. And like basically what it becomes is kind of a certain kind of like a recommendation systems problem that like how do we maximize the likelihood that this person right now will buy that item by seeing the endorsements and by seeing the description and so forth. Now, of course, like when we think about these really visceral experiences, almost like a game-like experiences, like for buying stuff, of course, the actual way how you generate these images is super critical. And now, again, I mean, like you can definitely go to Midjourney today. You can go like to use any stable diffusion model today and get something. But again, I mean, like in a world that we are about to enter in a few years' time, this is what everybody will be doing. And if you do the very same thing as everybody else, and you're, I can show you here. Maybe I shouldn't go back so much, but like the funny example here. If your like tables have 5 legs, I mean that's not gonna fly. So what you want to do is that like you want to make sure that like your store that's going to be the store like the sofa store of the future, it can actually like do these things better than anyone else. And also like what is really important to recognize that this is not some kind of like a YC demo day, like where you just like build something like this, but it's going to be an actual business. Which means that like you quite carefully not just generate some random images of sofas, but you actually like generate things that like maximize your revenue. Like for instance, like when I used to be at Netflix had a lot of soul-seeking whether they should be promoting their own original content versus licensed content, which of course has a huge business implications. The same thing here. I mean, maybe the leather sofas are like have a much higher margins than the other sofas, and like then you have to promote things accordingly. And now, like since many of you raised hand, like kind of about like having built other machine learning systems in the past, also what is interesting is that of course like these systems, like here, like in the middle, of course coexist with the kind of in the wider context of businesses that are becoming only more sophisticated. So of course, like you can imagine that like a company that's operating this like a massively successful online store, they want to be very clever about inventory forecasts. They like of course like want to optimize the logistics of carrying these big items. And of course, like what we talked about the marketing, like you want to be very more smart about it. So for instance, I used to work in like ad tech, building machine learning for ad tech for 4 years. And I can guarantee you that like about half of the money that people spend on marketing goes to waste. Not the other half, but the other half does. And like you have to do it, but also like you can be very smart like how you do it. And that's the only way basically how you can survive in the long term. So you want to do that well. And of course, that should tie into the fact that like how much money you can actually get from the customer base and so forth. So now, like what you see in this image is basically a company that is becoming increasingly sophisticated by applying machine learning and AI in all kinds of places, in like both on the kind of the back office side as well as of course the kind of the very like experience itself. And like we can have this meetup again in 10 years time, and we can look at this slide again and like see like if this is actually what will be happening. But I mean, based on everything that we have been seeing over the past many years, this is exactly what will be happening. And it won't be only sofas, and like it won't be only e-commerce, but it will be every experience. It will be entertainment, it will be fintech, like it will be logistics, it will be healthcare, and like everything will look like this. And now, of course, like for us as builders, like who at the end of the day are responsible for delivering these systems, I mean, this should kind of give you cold sweat. That like what we are seeing here is like 10 different systems, and like if you look at each one of these systems, they're actually like extremely challenging even research problems. There are many open research questions here that like we don't even quite know like how to do well. So there's no chance that like there's some like easy off-the-shelf solution for many of these questions. And the only way like how you can possibly start like doing these things is that like you now have like a proper like a tooling, and like then of course you need proper people to kind of then start like iterating on these ideas. And I wanted to like share this with you for the reason that like when we were at Netflix, like we used to be in this situation that like Netflix, of course, like has infinite appetite to build systems like this. And the challenge then became that like, well, I mean, on the one hand, you could say that, well, maybe like the inventory forecast kind of classical like machine learning is so different from these newer models that like maybe like we just like figure it out separately. But like as all of you know, like who have been working on software systems before, it is highly beneficial to try to simplify. And instead of like all these 10 projects like wanting to kind of, or like having to come up with the infrastructure by themselves, you would actually like have something that's in common. And now, of course, the kind of a big question becomes then like how on earth like can we like help all projects like this? And we started actually like thinking about this question already many years ago, already back in 2017 at Netflix, and kind of like really starting like from a very practical angle. I mean, not like kind of some new like a high-flying paradigm like of doing distributed compute. I mean, that has been tried before, but like really practically thinking that like what are the questions that apply to all projects? And now when you think about it, there are like some things that are kind of universal. I mean, the first thing here is obviously, it's kind of like almost like a truism that yes, everybody needs data. And like, of course, the data comes in different shapes and sizes. The data that you need for the inventory forecast, maybe structured data from Snowflake, is very different than what you need for the image generator. But I mean, like you need to think about data. You also like need to think about the data governance questions. Also, the sad fact about this is that although like we are able to build these new businesses and new interfaces, new experiences, of course, the overall like a societal landscape won't change overnight. I mean, it will take 100 years for it to change, which means that like we have the same laws about privacy, we have some like regulations, the same compliance requirements. So we somehow have to figure out how to do all this stuff within the existing frameworks without like breaking too many things on the way. Now, the second like really important part, and this is a defining difference compared to those 1970s style database like based applications, is that suddenly everything is way more compute hungry than ever before. And of course, like we all know, like kind of how much compute power and how many like GPUs that nobody can get access to, like is required to kind of build these LLMs. But also like kind of even on the kind of this like classical ML side, it might be a question that like maybe you just need a box with 16 CPUs, or like maybe you need like 100 of them to do hyperparameter search or something like this. Or like in some cases, like maybe you need some like a very specialized like a type of GPU to do some like massive model. So what's happening now, and like what has been happening for years, is that compute is getting more fragmented. Compute is getting more heterogeneous. And some of you may remember that maybe about like, let's see, that would have been about 10 years ago, maybe there was like Hadoop and there was MapReduce. And there was this idea that we have a universal compute paradigm and we can map all these projects in this one paradigm, and like then we just can have a big Hadoop cluster and all our problems are solved. And of course, like there was hope that maybe we can do the same thing with Spark and so forth. But now if you look at this list, it is becoming painfully obvious that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There isn't like one universal thing of doing anything. In contrast, like you kind of need CPUs, you need GPUs, sometimes you need distributed training, sometimes you need big boxes, sometimes you need many boxes, and it's kind of all over the place. And I don't think that that will get simplified anytime soon. The next big realization was that these systems are never just a simple function that you run in a notebook. When building real-world systems, there are always like a multiple interrelated components, sometimes hundreds of interrelated components, which means that like you have to have some kind of a backbone, some kind of like a system that allows you to orchestrate all these moving parts. So for instance, like you could imagine that like even in the simplest inventory forecast, like maybe you have to do a bit of an ETL to get the data, maybe you have to get the data frame, maybe you do feature engineering, maybe you train 100 models, you choose the best model, you write the results to a database. Or like maybe like when you're like fine-tuning your models, like you need to fine-tune the model and then you need to produce the embeddings again that you can send to a vector database and whatnot. So again, like you need that like a substrate to kind of do that orchestration. Not to mention the fact that like oftentimes we are not talking about single models, but I mean there are multiple interdependent models that need to be orchestrated together. The second thing that's, well, I guess now a fourth thing that's painfully obvious is that like you won't get any of these projects right from the get-go. So like inevitably, like what you can do is that you can start somewhere, you can start like doing something simple. Maybe you can even start by calling OpenAI APIs. But over time, like you need to keep iterating. And as you are iterating, you need to keep track of everything. And of course, like everybody who has been doing software engineering, like you probably keep track of code in using Git and GitHub and like CI/CD and so forth. But like, of course, like anybody who has been following MLOps field knows, I mean, like, of course, in the context of ML, like we also want to keep track of models and like we want to keep track of data and so forth. And now you can imagine that like this hasn't like changed in any way like in this world of LLMs. Today, let's say we have the Llama 2 as a foundation model, but I mean like maybe there will be Llama 3, there will be Llama 4, and there will be Llama 17. And then like what happens is that you have a Sofa store, and the Sofa store like is using Llama 12 as the foundation model. And now like Llama 14 comes out, and like somebody fine tunes and like kind of produces embeddings for that. And what you then want to do is that you want to have an A/B test where you compare, because like in this world there's never a single pull request review where you can just say that yes, I mean like we have reviewed the code and like everything looks good and it's gonna work. The only way if you know that like any of this is going to work is that you have to subject them to the actual like real world scenarios and then like do A/B testing and stuff like that. So that's gonna get a bit more complicated. Well, goes without saying that then like when you operate these things in production, life, again, I mean like it's not getting any simpler in a sense that we have some best practices on the SRE side, like how we operate like a big large scale microservices. Well, I mean how we do it like in a world like this is definitely kind of a way hazier, like kind of for many companies. Also like one thing that's super important to notice is that these things don't exist in isolation. You want to connect all these systems to upstream systems, like your databases. You want to connect them to downstream databases and like the downstream, like whatever microservices you may have. And then like, of course, taking into account that this is a large-scale distributed systems where anything may fail at any given point in time. So you need all the observability layers and so forth. And then at the top of the stack, there's kind of the kind of in some sense the obvious question that like, what are even the models that make all these things possible? And now, without going into details about the fact like how many like new libraries we have and like kind of how the tool chain for LLMs is like changing every week and so forth. One interesting challenge, like more on the kind of the software engineering side and infrastructure side, is that this means that our software supply chain, our like overall like ecosystem of libraries that we use and the dependency management is only getting more complicated. And this idea that, oh, I mean, let's just like slap everything in a Docker image might not fly that well anymore, especially like when the kind of new libraries like come out like every couple of weeks. It worked like when you just use SQL Alchemy, like with your like a 2014 style like a sofa store, and that changed like once in like 6 months, and it was always backwards compatible and so forth. But good luck trying to do the same with the LLM libraries today. So now, of course, like kind of this is something that like we have been thinking for a number of years, and like how can we actually help companies, like help people like doing stuff like this. I think like one key realization is that it's very hard to kind of like solve this question piecemeal. It is highly beneficial that like you have something that actually like unifies all these concerns in the same way as we have software stacks today. I mean, look at what has happened to the full stack engineering on the JavaScript side, and we have services like Vercel, and we have systems like Node.js, and of course like all the ecosystems around them that basically address all concerns that like you needed to build those 2014 style like web pages. So now, of course, like if you just like kind of extrapolate a bit, it's kind of obvious that like when we enter this world, like where everything is ML and AI driven, like we need similar approaches. We need similar frameworks that help you address all concerns that you have when you are building these systems. Well, now I'm sure that like many of you may be thinking that, okay, I mean, like what does it mean in practice and so forth? Well, unfortunately, I'm pretty much at the time here. So I just wanted to mention that like if this sounds relevant to you, I mean, like if you want to be the one like building the sofa store of the future, like check out our blog. Like there's like lots of interesting content, how you can use these new LLM techniques, how you can use GenAI, like how you can even integrate with the existing systems out there, because all the existing systems still exist. I mean, we can't like start from scratch. You need to, let's say, play nicely with Airflow. You need to play nicely like with all the kind of enterprise concerns about the compliance and security and so forth. And of course, there's the fact that like who knows, I mean, like what clouds you want to use and like where you find the GPUs, and then those questions need to be addressed as well. Well, as I mentioned, like we have been doing this for quite a number of years. I think now about like 6 or 7 years. Started at Netflix like way back when, and like since then there have been a good number of companies who have found like open source Metaflow useful. Like you can check it out at metaflow.org. There will be many exciting announcements coming later this fall, like related especially to kind of a distributed training, like how you can do all these like LLMs and like GenAI and so forth, without forgetting like all the kind of the existing stuff. Because as you saw in that slide, I mean, these like yellow boxes and purple boxes will coexist. And we love like helping companies who actually like want to optimize like the business, like all across departments, like from the back office, like doing the forecasting, doing things, even like operations research, all the way to the kind of the GenAI, LLM, like all those like futuristic new user experiences. I think that that's the way of the future. So anyways, so I think I'm pretty much at the time here. So invite you to start like building today. I mean, if you want any help there, if you want to check out open source stuff, we also have a like really active open source community at like slack.outerbounds.co. Like you can also like test Metaflow in the browser for free. Like go to the kind of outerbounds.com/sandbox. And thank you.